Part 4. Place Names, the Name. Section 2. These images were false for another reason also, namely that they were necessarily much simplified. Doubtless the object to which my imagination aspired, which my senses took in but incompletely and without any immediate pleasure, I had committed to the safe custody of names. Doubtless because I had accumulated there a store of dreams, those names now magnetized my desires. But names themselves are not very comprehensive. The most that I could do was to include in each of them 2 or 3 of the principal curiosities of the town, which would lie there side by side, without interval or partition. In the name of Baalbec, as in the magnifying glasses set in those penholders which one buys at seaside places, I could distinguish waves surging round a church built in the Persian manner. Perhaps, indeed, the enforced simplicity of these images was one of the reasons for the hold that they had over me. When my father had decided one year that we should go for the Easter holidays to Florence and Venice, not finding room to introduce into the name of Florence the elements that ordinarily constitute a town, I was obliged to let a supernatural city emerge from the impregnation by certain vernal scenes of what I supposed to be in its essentials the genius of Giotto. All the more, and because one cannot make a name extend much further in time than in space, like some of Giotto's paintings themselves, which show us at 2 separate moments the same person engaged in different actions, here lying on his bed, there just about to mount his horse. The name of Florence was divided into 2 compartments. In one, beneath an architectural dais, I gazed upon a fresco over which was partly drawn a curtain of morning sunlight, dusty, aslant, and gradually spreading. In the other, for since I thought of names not as an inaccessible ideal, but as a real and enveloping substance into which I was about to plunge, the life not yet lived, the life intact and pure, which I enclosed in them, gave to the most material pleasures, to the simplest scenes, the same attraction that they have in the works of the primitives. I moved swiftly, so as to arrive, as soon as might be, at the table that was spread for me with fruit and a flask of Chianti, across a Ponte Vecchio heaped with jonquils, narcissi, and anemones. That, for all that I was still in Paris, was what I saw, and not what was actually round about me. Even from the simplest, the most realistic point of view, the countries for which we long occupy, at any given moment, a far larger place in our true life than the country in which we may happen to be. Doubtless, if at that time I had paid more attention to what was in my mind when I pronounced the words "going to Florence, to Parma, to Pisa, to Venice," I should have realized that what I saw was in no sense a town, but something as different from anything that I knew, something as delicious as might be for a human race whose whole existence had passed in a series of late winter afternoons, that inconceivable marvel, a morning in spring. These images, unreal, fixed, always alike, filling all my nights and days, differentiated this period in my life from those which had gone before it, and might easily have been confused with it by an observer who saw things only from without, that is to say, who saw nothing. As in an opera, a fresh melody introduces a novel atmosphere which one could never have suspected if one had done no more than read the libretto. Still less if one had remained outside the theatre, counting only the minutes as they passed. And besides, even from the point of view of mere quantity, in our life the days are not all equal. To reach the end of a day, natures that are slightly nervous, as mine was, make use, like motor cars, of different speeds. There are mountainous, uncomfortable days, up which one takes an infinite time to pass, and days downward sloping, through which one can go at full tilt, singing as one goes. During this month, in which I went laboriously over, as over a tune, though never to my satisfaction, these visions of Florence, Venice, Pisa, from which the desire that they excited in me drew and kept something as profoundly personal as if it had been love, love for another person, I never ceased to believe that they corresponded to a reality independent of myself, and they made me conscious of as glorious a hope as could have been cherished by a Christian in the primitive age of faith, on the eve of his entry into Paradise. Moreover, without my paying any heed to the contradiction that there was in my wishing to look at and to touch with my organs of sense what had been elaborated by the spell of my dreams and not perceived by my senses at all, though all the more tempting to them in consequence, more different from anything that they knew, it was that which recalled to me the reality of these visions, which inflamed my desire all the more by seeming to hint a promise that my desire should be satisfied. And for all that the motive force of my exaltation was a longing for aesthetic enjoyments, the guide books ministered even more to it than books on aesthetics, and, more again than the guide books, the railway time-tables. What moved me was the thought that this Florence which I could see, so near and yet inaccessible, in my imagination, if the tract which separated it from me, in myself, was not one that I might cross, could yet be reached by a circuit, by a digression, were I to take the plain terrestrial path. When I repeated to myself, giving thus a special value to what I was going to see, that Venice was the school of Giorgione, the home of Titian, the most complete museum of the domestic architecture of the Middle Ages, I felt happy indeed. As I was even more when on one of my walks, as I stepped out briskly on account of the weather, which after several days of a precocious spring had relapsed into winter, like the weather that we had invariably found awaiting us at Combray in Holy Week, seeing upon the boulevards that the chestnut trees, though plunged in a glacial atmosphere that soaked through them like a stream of water, were none the less beginning, punctual guests, arrayed already for the party, and admitting no discouragement, to shape and chisel and curve in its frozen lumps the irrepressible verdure whose steady growth the abortive power of the cold might hinder but could not succeed in restraining. I reflected that already the Ponte Vecchio was heaped high with an abundance of hyacinths and anemones, and that the spring sunshine was already tinging the waves of the Grand Canal with so dusky an azure, with emeralds so splendid that when they washed and were broken against the foot of one of Titian's paintings, they could vie with it in the richness of their coloring. I could no longer contain my joy when my father, in the intervals of tapping the barometer and complaining of the cold, began to look out which were the best trains, and when I understood that by making one's way after luncheon into the coal-grimed laboratory, the wizard cell that undertook to contrive a complete transmutation of its surroundings, one could awaken next morning in the city of marble and gold, in which the building of the wall was of jasper and the foundation of the wall an emerald, so that it and the city of the lilies was not just artificial scenes which I could set up at my pleasure in front of my imagination, but did actually exist at a certain distance from Paris, which must inevitably be traversed if I wished to see them, at their appointed place, on the earth's surface, and at no other. In a word, they were entirely real. They became even more real to me when my father, by saying, "Well, you can stay in Venice from the 20th to the 29th, and reach Florence on Easter morning," made them both emerge no longer only from the abstraction of space, but from that imaginary time in which we place not one merely, but several of our travels at once, which do not greatly tax us, since they are but possibilities, that time which reconstructs itself so effectively that one can spend it again in one town after one has already spent it in another, and consecrated to them some of those actual calendar days which are certificates of the genuineness of what one does on them, for those unique days are consumed by being used, they do not return, one cannot live them again here when one has lived them elsewhere. I felt that it was towards the week that would begin with the Monday on which the laundress was to bring back the white waistcoat that I had stained with ink, that they were hastening to busy themselves with the duty of emerging from that ideal time in which they did not as yet exist, those two queen cities of which I was soon to be able, by the most absorbing kind of geometry, to inscribe the domes and towers on a page of my own life. But I was still on the way only to the supreme pinnacle of happiness. I reached it finally, for not until then did the revelation burst upon me that on the clattering streets, reddened by the light reflected from Giorgione's frescoes, It was not as I had, despite so many promptings, continued to imagine, the men majestic and terrible as the sea, bearing armor that gleamed with bronze beneath the folds of their blood-red cloaks, who would be walking in Venice next week on the Easter Vigil, but that I myself might be the minute personage whom, in an enlarged photograph of St. Mark's that had been lent to me, the operator had portrayed in a bowler hat in front of the portico, when I heard my father say, "It must be pretty cold still on the Grand Canal. Whatever you do, don't forget to pack your winter greatcoat and your thick suit." At these words I was raised to a sort of ecstasy, a thing that I had until then deemed impossible. I felt myself to be penetrating indeed between those rocks of amethyst, like a reef in the Indian Ocean, by a supreme muscular effort, a long way in excess of my real strength, stripping myself, as of a shell that served no purpose, of the air in my own room which surrounded me. I replaced it by an equal quantity of Venetian air, that marine atmosphere, indescribable and peculiar as the atmosphere of the dreams which my imagination had secreted in the name of Venice. I could feel at work within me a miraculous disincarnation. It was at once accompanied by that vague desire to vomit which one feels when one has a very sore throat. And they had to put me to bed with a fever so persistent that the doctor not only assured my parents that a visit that spring to Florence and Venice was absolutely out of the question, but warned them that even when I should have completely recovered, I must for at least a year give up all idea of traveling and be kept from anything that was liable to excite me. And alas, he forbade also, most categorically, my being allowed to go to the theatre to hear Berma. The sublime artist whose genius Bergotte had proclaimed might, by introducing me to something else that was perhaps as important and as beautiful, have consoled me for not having been to Florence and Venice, for not going to Baalbek. My parents had to be content with sending me, every day, to the Champs Elysees, in the custody of a person who would see that I did not tire myself. This person was none other than Françoise, who had entered our service after the death of my Aunt Léonie. Going to the Champs Elysees I found unendurable. If only Bergotte had described the place in one of his books, I should no doubt have longed to see and to know it, like so many things else of which a simulacrum had first found its way into my imagination. That kept things warm, made them live, gave them personality, and I sought then to find their counterpart in reality. But in this public garden there was nothing that attached itself to my dreams. One day, as I was weary of our usual place beside the wooden horses, Françoise had taken me for an excursion, across the frontier guarded at regular intervals by the little bastions of the barley sugar women, into those neighboring but foreign regions, where the faces of the passers-by were strange, where the goat carriage went past. Then she had gone away to lay down her things on a chair that stood with its back to a shrubbery of laurels. While I waited for her, I was pacing the broad lawn, of meager, close-cropped grass, already faded by the sun, dominated at its far end by a statue rising from a fountain, in front of which a little girl with reddish hair was playing with a shuttlecock, when, from the path, another little girl, who was putting on her cloak and covering up her battledore, called out sharply, "Good bye, Gilberte. I'm going home now. Don't forget. We're coming to you this evening after dinner." The name Gilberte passed close by me, evoking all the more forcibly her whom it labeled, in that it did not merely refer to her, as one speaks of a man in his absence, but was directly addressed to her. It passed thus close by me, in action, so to speak, with a force that increased with the curve of its trajectory, and as it drew near to its target, carrying in its wake, I could feel, the knowledge, the impression of her, to whom it was addressed, that belonged not to me, but to the friend who called to her, everything that while she uttered the words she more or less vividly reviewed, possessed in her memory, of their daily intimacy, of the visits that they paid to each other, of that unknown existence which was all the more inaccessible, all the more painful to me from being, conversely, so familiar, so tractable to this happy girl, who let her message brush past me without my being able to penetrate its surface, who flung it on the air with a light-hearted cry, letting float in the atmosphere the delicious attar which that message had distilled, by touching them with precision from certain invisible points in Mademoiselle Swann's life, from the evening to come, as it would be, after dinner at her home, forming, on its celestial passage through the midst of the children and their nursemaids, a little cloud, exquisitely colored, like the cloud that, curling over one of Poussin's gardens, reflects minutely, like a cloud in the opera, teeming with chariots and horses, some apparition of the life of the gods, casting finally on that ragged grass, at the spot on which she stood, at once a scrap of withered lawn and a moment in the afternoon of the fair player, who continued to beat up and catch her shuttlecock until a governess with a blue feather in her hat had called her away. A marvelous little band of light, of the color of heliotrope, spread over the lawn like a carpet on which I could not tire of treading to and fro with lingering feet, nostalgic and profane, while Françoise shouted, "Come on, button up your coat, look, and let's get away." And I remarked for the first time how common her speech was, and that she had, alas, no blue feather in her hat. Only, would she come again to the Champs Elysees? Next day she was not there, but I saw her on the following days. I spent all my time revolving round the spot where she was at play with her friends, to such effect that once, when they found they were not enough to make up a prisoner's base, she sent one of them to ask me if I cared to complete their side, and from that day I played with her whenever she came. But this did not happen every day. There were days when she had been prevented from coming by her lessons, by her catechism, by a luncheon party, by the whole of that life, separated from my own, which twice only, condensed into the name of Gilberte, I had felt pass so painfully close to me, in the hawthorn lane near Combray, and on the grass of the Champs Elysees. On such days she would have told us beforehand that we should not see her. If it were because of her lesson, she would say, "It is too tiresome. I shan't be able to come to-morrow. You will all be enjoying yourselves here without me," with an air of regret which to some extent consoled me. If, on the other hand, she had been invited to a party, and I, not knowing this, asked her whether she was coming to play with us, she would reply, "Indeed, I hope not. Indeed, I hope Mamma will let me go to my friends." But on these days I did at least know that I should not see her, whereas on others, without any warning, her mother would take her for a drive, or some such thing, and next day she would say, "Oh, yes, I went out with Mamma," as though it had been the most natural thing in the world, and not the greatest possible misfortune for some one else. There were also the days of bad weather on which her governess, afraid on her own account of the rain, would not bring Gilberte to the Champs Elysees. And so, if the heavens were doubtful, from early morning I would not cease to interrogate them, observing all the omens. If I saw the lady opposite just inside her window putting on her hat, I would say to myself, "That lady is going out. It must therefore be weather in which one can go out. Why should not Gilberte do the same as that lady?" But the day grew dark. My mother said that it might clear again, that one burst of sunshine would be enough, but that more probably it would rain. And if it rained, of what use would it be to go to the Champs Elysees? And so from breakfast time my anxious eyes never left the uncertain, clouded sky. It remained dark. Outside the window the balcony was gray. Suddenly, on its sullen stone, I did not indeed see a less negative color, but I felt as it were an effort towards a less negative color, the pulsation of a hesitating ray that struggled to discharge its light. A moment later the balcony was as pale and luminous as a standing water at dawn, and 1,000 shadows from the ironwork of its balustrade had come to rest on it. A breath of wind dispersed them. The stone grew dark again, but like tamed creatures they returned, they began imperceptibly to grow lighter, and by one of those continuous crescendos, such as in music at the end of an overture, carry a single note to the extreme fortissimo, making it pass rapidly through all the intermediate stages, I saw it attain to that fixed, unalterable gold of fine days, on which the sharply cut shadows of the wrought iron of the balustrade were outlined in black like a capricious vegetation, with a fineness in the delineation of their smallest details which seemed to indicate a deliberate application, an artist's satisfaction, and with so much relief, so velvety a bloom in the restfulness of their sombre and happy mass, that in truth those large and leafy shadows which lay reflected on that lake of sunshine seemed aware that they were pledges of happiness and peace of mind. Brief, fading ivy, climbing, fugitive flora, the most colorless, the most depressing to many minds, of all that creep on walls or decorate windows, to me the dearest of them all, from the day when it appeared upon our balcony, like the very shadow of the presence of Gilberte, who was perhaps already in the Champs Elysees, and as soon as I arrived there would greet me with, "Let's begin at once, you are on my side." Frail, swept away by a breath, but at the same time in harmony, not with the season, with the hour, a promise of that immediate pleasure which the day will deny or fulfill, and thereby of the one paramount immediate pleasure, the pleasure of loving and of being loved, more soft, more warm upon the stone than even moss is, alive, a ray of sunshine sufficing for its birth, and for the birth of joy even in the heart of winter. And on those days when all other vegetation had disappeared, when the fine jerkins of green leather which covered the trunks of the old trees were hidden beneath the snow, after the snow had ceased to fall, but when the sky was still too much overcast for me to hope that Gilberte would venture out, then suddenly, inspiring my mother to say, "Look, it's quite fine now, I think you might perhaps try going to the Champs Elysees after all." On the mantle of snow that swathed the balcony, the sun had appeared and was stitching seams of gold, with embroidered patches of dark shadow. That day we found no one there, or else a solitary girl on the point of departure, who assured me that Gilberte was not coming. The chairs, deserted by the imposing but uninspiring company of governesses, stood empty. Only near the grass was sitting a lady of uncertain age who came in all weathers, dressed always in an identical style, splendid and sombre, to make whose acquaintance I would have at that period sacrificed, had it lain in my power, all the greatest opportunities in my life to come. For Gilberte went up every day to speak to her. She used to ask Gilberte for news of her dearest mother, and it struck me that if I had known her, I should have been for Gilberte some one wholly different, some one who knew people in her parents' world. While her grandchildren played together at a little distance, she would sit and read the debates, which she called "my old debates," as with an aristocratic familiarity she would say, speaking of the police sergeant or the woman who let the chairs, "My old friend the police sergeant," or "the chair keeper and I, who are old friends." End of Part 4, Section 2.